The salt-kissed wind was my first companion on the morning I turned 70. It whispered through the seams of my old woolen coat, a familiar briny ghost that had walked with me on this same stretch of California shore for the better part of 4 decades. The Pacific was a sheet of hammered silver under a sky the color of a dove's wing, the horizon a blurred seam between two worlds. I walked as I always did, with my hands buried deep in my pockets, the rhythm of the waves my metronome, the crunch of sand and shell under my boots the only percussion. 70. The number felt like a weight in my bones. It was a solid, immovable door, closed on the riotous, colorful rooms of youth and middle age. Behind me lay the echoes of a life well lived, the phantom laughter of my children, the steady, comforting presence of my late husband, Harold, the busy hum of a career as a librarian, a life built on order and quiet certainty. But on this day, the quiet felt profound. My daughter Claire had called at dawn, her voice bright and chirpy from New York. "Happy birthday, Mom! The kids made you a video, and a package is coming, don't peek." My son David had sent a sprawling, beautiful bouquet that now perfumed the silent living room of my empty nest. There were cards on the mantel, well wishes from friends. I was loved. I knew this. I was grateful. Yet a peculiar loneliness, fine and cold as sea mist, had settled around my heart. It was the loneliness of being the keeper of memories, the last one standing at the feast of one's own history. The beach was deserted, as it often was this early. Winter storms had sculpted the sand into new dunes and left behind a rackline of tangled kelp, driftwood skeletons, and the iridescent confetti of broken mussel shells. My eyes, trained by a lifetime of looking for interesting stones and sea glass, scanned the debris, and then they stopped. There, half buried in the wet sand where the tide had retreated, was a bottle. It wasn't a modern beer bottle or a plastic water flask. It was an old-fashioned, thick glass soda bottle, the kind with a bulbous bottom and a narrow neck, the glass itself a murky greenish-brown, clouded by decades of immersion. It was encrusted with a miniature calcified landscape of barnacles and worm tubes, a tiny, abandoned continent. The cork, dark and swollen, was still wedged firmly in its mouth. A shiver entirely unrelated to the chill morning air traced a path down my spine. It was an artifact, a message in a bottle. The stuff of childhood stories and romantic daydreams. I hadn't seen one since I was a girl, building castles in the sand and dreaming of pirates and treasure. I knelt, my knees protesting with a soft pop. The sand was cold and damp through the fabric of my trousers. I reached out, my fingers hesitating for a moment before closing around the cool, rough glass. It felt heavy, significant. I worked it loose from the sand's grasp with a soft, sucking sound. Who would do such a thing in this age of satellites and smartphones? A child on a family vacation, playing at being a castaway? A romantic soul like I once was? I held it up, turning it in the pale morning light. I could just make out the shape of a rolled parchment inside, yellowed and thick. My heart gave a small, curious thump against my ribs. The cork was stubborn, sealed by time and sea. I couldn't budge it with my fingers. A practical voice, Harold's voice, whispered in my mind, "Leave it, Eleanor, it's just trash. Some tourist nonsense." But a stronger, more insistent pull, that same nudge that had guided me to Harold in a crowded university library, that had told me to buy this very cottage overlooking the sea, urged me on. I found a piece of driftwood, a sturdy gray branch worn smooth by the ocean. Using it as a lever, I pried at the cork. It resisted, then gave way with a soft, sighing pop that was swallowed by the wind. The smell that escaped was of salt and deep thyme, of secrets long kept. My hands were trembling now, genuinely trembling. I tipped the bottle, gently tapping its bottom. The scroll, tied with a faded red ribbon, slid into my palm. It felt fragile, ancient. For a moment, I was afraid to unroll it, afraid the paper would crumble to dust in my hands, this small mystery lost before it could be solved. I sat down fully on the sand, ignoring the dampness seeping through my clothes. With infinite care, I untied the brittle ribbon. It fell apart. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I began to unroll the parchment. The script that met my eyes was elegant, cursive, written in a blue ink that had faded to the color of a stormy sky, and the first two words, my name, stopped my heart dead in my chest. My dearest Eleanor. The air left my lungs in a rush. No one had called me that in 50 years. Not since I was Eleanor Moss, a girl of 19 with flowers in her hair and a head full of poetry. I was Eleanor Preston now, a widow, a grandmother, but this was written to that girl. The handwriting. Oh God, the handwriting. I knew its loops and slants as intimately as I knew my own. It was a script I had traced with my fingers on love notes passed in university hallways on the margins of shared books of Yeats and Donne. It belonged to Samuel Thorne. A sound escaped me, a small, wounded thing, lost to the crash of a nearby wave. Samuel, the boy who had been the sun and moon to me, the boy who had vanished between one day and the next during our final year at Berkeley, leaving no forwarding address, no explanation, just a void of silence that had nearly broken me. Tears, hot and sudden, blurred the faded ink. I wiped them away fiercely with the back of my hand. I had to read this. I had to know. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then the ocean has been kinder to this bottle than life has been to me. I have to believe it found you. I'm writing this from a dock in Maine, watching the sun set on a life I never wanted. My father is making me leave. The family business is failing. He says we have to go back to Ireland tomorrow, and he forbade me from seeing you. He said I'd only hold you back from the brilliant future you deserve. He said it would be a clean break for your own good. He has taken the phone. He will not let me out of his sight until we are on the plane. He says this love of ours is a youthful fever, that it will pass and we will both be better for it. But he is wrong, Eleanor. He is so wrong. You are not a fever. You are my blood. You are my breath. So I'm sending my heart out to sea, hoping against hope it finds its way to you. I don't know if you will get this in a week, a year, or never, but I cannot leave this continent without telling you the truth. I love you. I have loved you from the moment I saw you in that dusty sunlight of the lecture hall, arguing with Professor Albee about Wordsworth. I will love you until the stars themselves grow cold. Please don't forget me. Forever yours, Samuel, June 12, 1974. The world narrowed to the piece of paper in my hands. The roar of the ocean faded to a distant hum. All I could hear was the frantic, hammering beat of my own heart. I read it again and again. The pain I had carried for half a century, the bewildering heartbreak that had taken years to scar over, shifted its shape. It was no longer a story of abandonment, of being unloved. It was a story of theft, of a love that was real, that was profound, that was stolen from us. He didn't leave me. He was taken. Tears streamed down my face now, unchecked, falling onto the parchment. I cried for Samuel, the terrified 20-year-old boy on a cold dock in Maine, sacrificing his heart to the indifferent sea. I cried for myself, for the girl who had spent months staring at the phone, jumping at every knock on the door, her confidence slowly eroding into a conviction of her own inadequacy. The why that had haunted me for decades finally had an answer, and it was both a balm and a fresh, more complex wound. I sat there for a long time, until the sun grew warmer on my back and the tide began to creep back in. The letter was a tsunami, washing away the landscape of my past and leaving a new, unfamiliar one in its wake. It was only when I went to carefully re-roll the parchment, my hands still shaking, that I saw it. On the reverse side, in a different ink, a fresh, vibrant blue ballpoint stark against the aged paper, was a phone number, an American number with a Maine area code. And beneath it, 2 words that sent another, entirely different shock through my system. Still waiting? The world snapped back into focus with a dizzying intensity. The cry of the gulls, the chill of the wind, the solid weight of the bottle in my lap. This wasn't just a relic. This was a current, a live wire. He had been here, recently. He had found this bottle or kept it, and he had added this. Still waiting? My mind raced, a frantic, tumbling cascade of thoughts. How? Why now? Was it a cruel joke? But who would joke about such a thing? It had to be him. The question was playful, daring, so utterly Samuel it made my chest ache. It was the kind of gambit he would have made, the boy who once convinced me to skip class and go to the beach on a Tuesday. 70 years old, a widow, a grandmother. And I was sitting on a beach holding a question that had been 50 years in the making. The sensible thing, the Eleanor Preston thing, would be to go home, put the kettle on, place this bottle on the mantel as a curious artifact, and call my children. But Eleanor Moss, the girl who had just been resurrected by a ghost from the sea, was screaming something else entirely. I stood up, my legs unsteady. I tucked the letter safely into the inner pocket of my coat, my fingers brushing against the hard rectangle of my smartphone. I looked at the vast, gray, endless ocean, then down at the phone in my hand. The walk back to my cottage was a blur. The familiar path, the driftwood steps, the white picket fence, they all seemed like a stage set, unreal and insubstantial. The only thing that felt real was the weight of the parchment against my heart and the 10 digits seared onto the back of my eyelids. I entered the quiet cottage. The bouquet from David scented the air with lilies. The blinking light on the answering machine indicated a message, probably from Claire again. I ignored it all. I went to the kitchen table, the same oak table where I'd fed my children, planned vacations with Harold, graded 1,000 papers. I laid the phone down next to the barnacled bottle. My hands were ice cold. I fumbled with the screen, pulling up the keypad. I typed in the number. My finger hovered over the green call button. What would I say? Hello, is this the love of my life whom I haven't spoken to in 5 decades? What if it was a wrong number? What if it was his son or his grandson? What if he was gone? The hope that had begun to flutter in my chest felt dangerously fragile. I thought of Harold. Good, kind, steady Harold. We had built a good life, a true life. He had been my rock, my best friend. He knew about Samuel, of course, in the vague way one knows about a partner's past loves. He knew it had been a painful ending. Would he understand this? Would he want me to make this call? I looked at his photograph on the wall, his warm, crinkled eyes, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that he would. He would have wanted me to have answers. He would have wanted me to be happy. I took a deep, shuddering breath and pressed the button. I put the phone to my ear. It rang. Once, twice. The sound was impossibly loud in the silent kitchen. On the 3rd ring, it connected. There was no voice, just the sound of breathing and the faint, unmistakable crash of waves in the background. He was by the sea, just as I was. And then a voice, deeper, weathered by time, but with a timbre I would have known anywhere. A sound that reached across half a century and wrapped itself around my heart. Eleanor, he said. And the world began again. The sound of my name spoken in that voice unraveled 50 years in an instant. The kitchen, the birthday, the quiet widowhood. It all fell away, and I was back in a sun-drenched lecture hall in the fall of 1973. Miss Moss? A little less passion and a little more precision, if you please. Professor Albee peered over his spectacles, a faint smile playing on his lips. I had just delivered a fervent and probably slightly incoherent defense of Wordsworth's connection to nature, arguing that it wasn't just observation, but a true spiritual merging. I'm sorry, Professor, I said, my face flushing. I just think we do him a disservice by... A disservice is to ignore the structural genius because you're swept away by the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, a voice beside me interjected. It was a young man with dark, unruly curls and eyes the color of the sea after a storm. He had a faint musical accent I couldn't quite place. But isn't the overflow itself the point? The structure is just the vessel to carry the feeling. Otherwise, it's just an empty cup. Professor Albee chuckled. Mr. Thorne, always ready with a metaphor. Very well, empty cups and overflowing vessels. Class dismissed. Continue your debate outside. The boy, Samuel, turned to me, his eyes alight with mischief and intelligence. Samuel Thorne, he said, offering his hand. Eleanor Moss, I replied, taking it. His grip was warm, firm, and that was a very good metaphor. It was, wasn't it? He said without a hint of arrogance, just a simple statement of fact. I'm from Belfast. We specialize in saying serious things in roundabout ways. It's a survival skill. Can I walk you to your next class? I feel we have only scratched the surface of this cup's emptiness. That was how it began. Not with a bang, but with a literary debate. Samuel was a graduate student in literature, a year ahead of me, on a scholarship that felt like a miracle to him. He had grown up in a working-class family in Northern Ireland, his world shaped by the Troubles, his escape route a fierce, burning intellect and a scholarship to an American university. He saw the world through a poet's eyes and a survivor's heart, a combination I found utterly intoxicating. We spent that fall and winter in a glorious bubble. We read poetry to each other in the university's botanical garden, his Irish lilt giving Yeats and Heaney a new, profound authenticity. He took me to dusty second-hand bookshops in San Francisco, where he would find obscure volumes of Irish history and mythology and explain them to me with a passion that was contagious. He taught me that craic wasn't just fun, it was the lifeblood of conversation, the art of good company. I, in turn, showed him the California he'd only seen in movies, the vast redwood forests, the rugged coastline, the unironic joy of a drive-in movie theater. He was my first in everything, my first real love, my first lover, my first true intellectual equal. We talked about the future with the boundless certainty of the young. He would get his doctorate, maybe teach here in America. I would write. We would live in a house filled with books and light, somewhere near the ocean. It was a future so vivid, so tangible, we could almost touch it. But there was a shadow over his life, one he spoke of only in hushed, pained tones. His father, Seamus, a proud, stubborn man who had built a small import business in Belfast, shipping Irish goods to the pockets of the diaspora in America. The business was struggling, suffocated by the political instability and a changing economy. Seamus Thorne saw his son's academic life as a frivolous indulgence, a betrayal of the family that needed him. The phone calls from Ireland were tense, filled with guilt and recrimination. "I told him about you," Samuel said to me one night in his small apartment, the air thick with the smell of books and cheap wine. We were lying on a rug on the floor, listening to Van Morrison. He said an American girl would never understand our world, that she would tie you here when your duty is at home. "He doesn't know me," I said, indignant. "He doesn't want to," Samuel replied, his voice heavy. "He sees you as a threat. Another anchor holding me in this new world he doesn't trust." The arguments grew more frequent. The spring of 1974 arrived, and with it, a pall of anxiety that settled over Samuel. The phone calls became more desperate. His father was talking about pulling him out of school, about forcing him to come home and save the business. The last time I saw him was on a Tuesday. We had a picnic in the park. He was quiet, distracted, his mind clearly an ocean away. "He's given me an ultimatum," he said finally, not meeting my eyes. "He's coming to get me, next week. He says it's over. The money is gone. I have to come back to Belfast." "No," I said, the word a plea. "Samuel, no, you can't. Your thesis, your future—" "My family, Eleanor," he said, his voice cracking. "It's my family." "We can figure something out," I insisted, clutching his hand. "You can finish your degree. You can get a job here. We can help them from here." He looked at me then, and the despair in his eyes terrified me. "You don't know my father. When he sets his mind to something—" He walked me back to my dormitory that night. He kissed me goodbye, a long, deep, desperate kiss that felt like an ending. "I'll fix this," he whispered against my lips. "I promise. I'll talk to him. I'll make him understand." I believed him. I believed in his intelligence, his charm, his ability to talk his way out of anything. I went to bed that night worried but sure that he would find a way. He didn't. The next day he wasn't in class. I called his apartment. No answer. I went over. The landlord said he'd left early that morning with a man, his father, I presumed. They had packed his things and left. He had no forwarding address. The rent was paid through the end of the month. That was it. I was bewildered, then frantic, then devastated. I called the university. They had no information. He had withdrawn. I wrote letters to the address in Belfast he'd once given me. They all came back, stamped, returned to sender. It was as if he had been erased. The pain was a physical thing, a constant, gnawing ache in my chest. How could he do this? How could he just leave without a word? The only explanation my bruised heart could conjure was that his father had been right, that I wasn't enough, that his love for me hadn't been strong enough to fight for. I built a wall around that pain, and over the years I moved on. I met Harold, a kind, solid engineering student who offered a love that was steady and sure, not a turbulent, poetic fire. I learned to be happy. I loved Harold deeply, truly. But the ghost of Samuel Thorne, the ghost of that unanswered question, always lingered in the quietest corners of my heart. And now, 50 years later, I had my answer. He had fought for me, in the only way he knew how. Trapped and desperate, he had sent his heart out to sea. "Eleanor," he said again, his voice pulling me back from the past, back to the kitchen, to the phone pressed hard against my ear. All I could manage was a whisper. "Samuel." There was a long, shaky exhale on the other end of the line. "You found it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My God, you found it." "I found it," I repeated, the words feeling inadequate, surreal. "This morning, on the beach." "On your birthday," he said softly. A fresh wave of shock washed over me. You know it's my birthday?" "I've never forgotten a single thing about you, Eleanor Moss," he said, and the simple, direct statement stole my breath. "I'm in California. I've been here for a week. I've been walking that beach every morning, hoping, praying I might see you, or that you might find the bottle I put back." "You're here?" My voice rose an octave. "In Sea Ridge?" "A few miles down the coast in a rented cottage. I had to come. After Ma passed away last year, I found the letter. I'd kept it all these years in an old trunk. I never sent another. I was too ashamed. Ashamed I hadn't been braver. Ashamed I'd let him take me away. Reading it again, I knew I had to try. One last mad, romantic, foolish try. I flew to Maine to that same dock. It's a car park now, and then I flew here. I didn't know if you still lived here. I looked you up online, saw that Harold, I saw that you had lost him. I'm so sorry, Eleanor." He had done all that. The sheer staggering effort of it left me dizzy. "We need to talk, Samuel," I said, my mind reeling. "Not on the phone." "Name the place," he said without a moment's hesitation. "Anywhere. Any time." "The lighthouse," I said, the words coming out before I could second-guess them. The old Point Vicente lighthouse was where we had gone on our first proper date. It was our place. "I remember," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "1 hour?" "1 hour," I confirmed, and ended the call. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely set the phone down. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the microwave. An old woman with silver hair and lines on her face stared back. But inside, a 19-year-old girl was putting on her best dress, her heart pounding with a wild, terrifying, glorious hope. The ghost had come ashore, and he was waiting for me at the lighthouse.